Welcome everyone to another workshop for the Infinite Space Bazaar. Today I'm excited to welcome Mustafa Albassam, the CEO of Celestia Labs, to teach us about rollups as sovereign chains. Mustafa, welcome. We're glad
Thank
to
you.
have you here. Yeah.
Good to be
Uh,
here.
would you like to do a quick intro and then we'll get started?
Yeah, as you said, I'm co-founder and CEO at Celestia Labs, which was a project started in 2019.
Awesome. Get to it.
So as Josh said, I'm going to be talking about rollups as sovereign chains, or this idea of sovereign rollups. And I'm going to be talking about like what. First of all, before talking about sovereign rollups, let's take a step back and discuss like what are rollups, and then how do they differentiate from sovereign rollups. And then I'll talk about like why sovereign rollups are a good idea and why they can be useful. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the existing state of sovereign rollup frameworks or how you can build sovereign rollups. So first of all, like what are rollups fundamentally? Rollups are basically blockchains that post their transactions to another blockchain known as a data layer. So it's effectively this idea of separating consensus and execution. And the point is that a rollup could have a set of sequencers or even one centralized sequencer, but you don't have to trust that sequencer to behave correctly. Because even if that sequencer misbehaves by including invalid transactions in the chain, someone could easily challenge that using a fraud proof to prove using the data posted on the data layer that those transactions were invalid. Or the sequencer could be required to post a ZK proof to prove that the transactions were actually valid. So you have three different types of rollup nodes. You have the sequences, which make the rollup blocks. You have the full nodes, which you can run a rollup full node, and full nodes verify the rollup chain by re-executing every transaction and potentially making fraud proofs if the transactions are invalid. And finally, you have light nodes, and in the case of Ethereum, that could also be an on-chain kind of light node that acts as a bridge. And those light nodes basically take in block headers and verify the rollup chain by checking the fraud or ZK proofs. And this is basically fundamentally what the idea is of a modular blockchain that separates consensus and execution. Rollups do the execution, whereas the base layer is only responsible for consensus and data. And you basically have three elements: execution, settlement, and consensus and data availability in the stack. Consensus provides ordering over arbitrary messages. Data availability provides a verifiable way to actually publish those ordered messages to so that you can prove to anyone that those messages are actually available to anyone that wants to download it and might want to reconstruct the state of any rollup that has posted that data to the data layer. And finally, you have the execution layer, which performs computation over the transactions to output a state, which might be a list of accounts and their balances. And finally, you have a settlement layer, which is kind of like the most controversial or loaded one. And in this presentation, I'm basically defining a settlement layer as a special case of execution layer that bridges or that provides a bridging hub between other execution layers. So, for example, rollup A and rollup B might want to transfer funds to each other or between each other. They can first transfer it to the settlement layer, which verifies the headers and the fraud proofs and validity proofs of these rollups, and then transfer it to rollup B, or vice versa.
And what's a good example? Oh, there we go. Sorry.
Yeah, but obviously Ethereum is a good example of that. Ethereum acts as a settlement layer for these rollups. So on Ethereum, as I mentioned previously, rollups have light nodes, and those light nodes can be on chain. And like the bridge contract on Ethereum is basically an on chain light node for rollups. The bridge contract downloads the block headers or receives the block headers for the rollup, and it can verify fraud or validity proofs. And Ethereum, in this case, is basically acting as a kind of enshrined settlement layer. And the reason why it's an enshrined settlement layer is because it's Ethereum, it's the bridge contract on Ethereum that's defining what the correct or canonical rollup chain is. So if the sequencer decides to like fork a chain, if your rollup is not a sovereign rollup but has enshrined Ethereum as a settlement layer, then the ultimate source of truth will be that bridge contract. So it's the bridge that defines that rollup. But let's talk about sovereign rollups and how they differ from rollups that enshrine settlement. So first of all, we have to remind ourselves that rollups are basically blockchains with their own what's called a fork choice rule. Now, the fork choice rule is basically, as I mentioned, if a rollup has a fork, let's say you have a malicious sequencer in that rollup, and they fork the chain. They say at block at height 1000, they produce two conflicting blocks, right? Then you have to basically choose the network has to choose or figure out what is the correct chain. And that fork choice rule basically resolves that conflict by choosing which part of the fork is actually the correct chain. So, for example, in proof of work, that will be settled by whichever block has the most proof of work. In proof of stake, that will be settled by whichever fork has the most accumulated stake, for example. For a rollup, that's typically typically figured out by how the blocks are ordered on data layer. But it depends if it's a sovereign rollup or a non-sovereign rollup. So in the case of a kind of like a typical rollup, as I mentioned, the fork choice rule, whether it's a sovereign rollup or non-sovereign rollup, the fork choice rule only says that a specific block is correct if that block, in the case of a ZK rollup, has a correct validity proof, or in the case of a optimistic rollup, does not have any fraud proof within a specific challenge window. And if you think about it, rollups are actually very similar to this pre-Ethereum protocol called Mastercoin, which was first kind of like first in 2013, where the Mastercoin protocol basically is very similar to this idea of a sovereign rollup, because you can, for example, USD T or Tether is actually built on this protocol, on the Bitcoin protocol. And what Mastercoin basically does, it allows you to create other chains or create other protocols on Bitcoin that basically use Bitcoin as data layer by embedding data in Bitcoin transactions. By embedding data in Bitcoin transactions, you're basically only using Bitcoin as a data layer to order and make available those transactions, but the execution of those transactions are basically happening off chain. But there's no bridge to Bitcoin. Like Mastercoin protocol or Tether, you cannot bridge those assets to Bitcoin or back and forth. So there's no bridge contract that defines what the correct choice, what the correct fork or view of that rollup is. Instead, you can say that's a sovereign rollup because ultimately it's the end users that define what the correct fork choice rule of that rollup is, or what the correct fork of that rollup is. So, as I mentioned, in the case of Ethereum, we have an Ethereum rollup with enshrined element. The fork choice rule of that rollup is basically whatever headers are submitted to that the smart contract on Ethereum. And importantly, you have to remember that because these rollups have fraud or validity proofs, that means those rollups have what's called a state transition function. And that basically defines what the transaction validity rules of that rollup are. So for example, things like what transactions are valid and what transactions are invalid. And so that means ultimately it's the Ethereum smart contract that defines what transactions are valid or what transactions are invalid, according to the fraud or validity proof system. But with sovereign rollups, the key difference is that because you're not enshrining a specific bridge contract, you're basically saying that it's not the bridge that defines the rollup. It's the users of the chain that define the rollup. And so what that means is that it's not the bridge that defines what transactions are valid or invalid in that rollup. It's the users that do. So for example, the users could decide to hard fork that rollup. Like let's say they wanted to, like for example, a few years ago, there was this massive hack on Ethereum called the DAO hack, where something like 5% of the ETH supply was compromised. And Ethereum did a hard fork to undo that hack because Ethereum is a sovereign chain. like who defines what the correct Ethereum chain is ultimately the end users of the system that defines what the correct chain is. So like if the Ethereum community decided to hard fork or do some kind of network upgrade that is not backwards compatible with the previous chain, they have the ability to do that because it's a sovereign chain, right? But if the rollup enshrines a smart contract as a bridge or for settlement, then the rollup will not be able to do that unless that smart contract is upgradable, which may break, which depending on how that's done, might defeat the whole purpose of a rollup. If there's an upgrade key, for example. So assuming like it's a kind of a pure rollup where that's a maximally secure rollup with no upgrade keys, then users it's not the end user that decides, or even if there is upgrade keys, it's not the end user that decides what the correct what if the rollup could be hard forked or not. It's the bridge that decides. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough. And if the bridge has an upgrade mechanism, then what that basically means, let's say that bridge is some committee, for example, then that's basically saying that the committee is deciding what transactions are valid or invalid in that rollup. And in some way, that kind of defeats the whole point of blockchains, because the whole point of blockchains is that you're not supposed to rely on any specific honest majority of people or some committee or even a DAO controlled by tokens to enforce the protocol rules of that chain. Because if you do, then what that effectively means is that you're effectively saying that some committee can, for example, violate the rules of the chain and steal all your money, for example, or print new money off thin air or blacklist someone. And that's not the threat model of the Bitcoin or Ethereum L1, for example. So with sovereign rollups, assuming that there isn't some enshrined bridge, the upgrade mechanism for a rollup is not some bridge, but it's the end users of the chain. Now, an interesting question about this is that now this is in theory, but in practice, you might ask like, what does it look like in practice? Like if, for example, 99% of the assets for a rollup are coming through one bridge, then sure, even if that rollup is sovereign, then maybe in practice it's not really a sovereign rollup because the Ethereum smart contract is ultimately has so much control, has so much influence over the canonical chain of the rollup that like also the pretty much the sovereignty is lost. Now, this is kind of comparable to, for example, like if you think of like Ethereum, if you think of USDT and USDC, USDT and USDC are basically like rollups, or not rollups, but USD bridge to Ethereum via a centralized third party. So in that sense, you can potentially consider Ethereum to be a sidechain to USDC or USDT, because if you consider, for example, if Ethereum wants to do a future controversial software upgrade, then and Tether or Circle doesn't like it, and they don't they don't upgrade their software or they don't participate in the hard fork. In practice, we might end up in a situation where even though the Ethereum community agreed that this is a good upgrade to do, then the market will decide that we don't want to be on a chain that's where the USDC and USDT has no value, and Circle and Tether will honor the value of those USDCs and USDT. So we're also going to reject that hard fork. And in that kind of scenario, USDC and USDT would have like overwhelming power or reduce the sovereignty of Ethereum as a chain. So similar to like if a rollup has 99% of its assets controlled by one smart contract bridge, that would be a similar scenario. But where sovereign rollups do make more sense and are kind of like interesting is if you create, not all rollups are designed to necessarily scale L1. So for example, you could imagine a scenario where a rollup, the most of the value of the rollup comes from assets not bridged from other chains, but from assets minted inside that rollup itself, for example. And in that scenario, then it kind of makes sense. Then the rollup will have a lot more sovereignty because the bridges will have way less value have the value that the assets in those bridges would have way less value than the actual assets natively minted on that chain. And it could also another similar scenario could be maybe you don't only have one bridge controlling 99% of the assets of the rollup. Maybe you have like multiple bridges. Maybe you have like 3 or 4 bridges. And this is like something that optimism is like wants to do. So, for example, like maybe a rollup has multiple canonical bridges. Maybe it has like a zk proof bridge, it has a validity bridge, it has an optimistic bridge. And let's say like it's not the case that 99% of the assets are through one bridge, but they're all equally distributed across kind of multiple bridges. Then it's the case that the rollup hasn't necessarily lost all of its sovereignty to one specific bridge, but there's multiple bridges that are participating in the fork choice rules that roll up. If the community of that rollup wants to do hard fork, then you have multiple bridges deciding whether their bridge should participate in that hard fork or not. If you think about like a sovereign rollup with a non-enshrined bridge, so like if you think about like a normally if the sovereign rollups don't share a DA layer, then effectively they would have no shared security. But if they do share a DA layer, then they would have the shared security, and their sovereign rollups could still bridge each other. It's just that, as I was saying, it's not so much that one single bridge, like in one smart contract, potentially upgradable by one committee, is deciding the entire fork choice of that rollup because 99% of assets are on that bridge. But you can have multiple bridges, and because that rollup might have most of its value in minted native tokens, then it's the case that rollup, and then the fork choice of that rollup is more kind of vaguely defined by the ecosystem of that rollup. And to me, this is very important because, as I mentioned, that the whole point of blockchains to begin with is not that some committee or some upgrade committee can decide unilaterally to violate the transaction rules of a rollup, and, for example, steal someone's money or print more money off thin air according to some like government order or regulations or politics. But the whole point of blockchains is that there's supposed to be trust minimized, and you don't have to trust any middlemen or third parties to behave accordingly to the rules of the chain, because the whole point is that you as an end user can run a fully validating node that actually verifies that the chain is correct. But if we give the power to a single bridge, then and like pretty much give that rollup no sovereignty, then that kind of, to me, that kind of like defeats the whole point of using a blockchain in the first place. So that's why I think sovereign rollups are kind of important, to make sure that rollups are kind of more similar or more aligned with the whole point of blockchains in the first place, and closer to the actual security model of the Bitcoin Ethereum L1. So as I mentioned, what are the advantages of sovereign rollups? Like, firstly, you have more freedom over the execution environment. You also have that with standard rollups, but the cool thing about sovereign rollups is that because you're not like confined to a specific, to making sure your validity proofs or forward proofs kind of fit within a specific format. For example, to satisfy the Ethereum virtual machine, you have a lot more flexibility over what you can do. So, for example, the Sovereign SDK, the validity proofs, because the validity proofs aren't defined by aren't processed by some smart contract. But what they've been able to do is they've been able to make ZK rollups that have way faster finality times than ZK rollups that are not sovereign and have enshrined settlement. And the reason for that is that because the rollup is defined by effectively the data posted on chain and by the end user, even before there's a ZK proof, you know that a block has finality, effectively, because you don't have to wait for the ZK proof to be on the enshrined bridge itself to know that the rollup has finality. You also have no sharing of computational resources, which means that, and that kind of also applies to the settlement layer. Rollups have effectively their own computational environment and don't have to share resources with everyone else. But most importantly, the most important thing is the ability to hard fork if something goes wrong. Because to me, this is the whole point. As I mentioned, this is the whole point of having a blockchain in the first place. which is this idea that the chain is defined by the community of that chain. But if you have a roll up with an enshrined bridge, you're effectively giving away. You effectively either have to accept that roll up is not upgradable, you're giving away that ability to some committee or some DAO, which kind of violates the whole point of a blockchain in the first place, in my opinion. And the cool thing about sovereign rollups is that they basically allow you to effectively have the ability to have the same advantages of having your own sovereign blockchain. Like, for example, if you create the Polkadot chain or Cosmos L1, your chain would be sovereign. But that requires a lot of overhead because you have to recruit a validator set. But with sovereign rollups, you can kind of use an existing data layer, but you still have sovereignty because that data layer does not define what the transaction validity rules of your chain, and it cannot prevent your chain from hard forking. And this kind of like, to me, a big point of blockchains is that it allows groups of people with shared goals or shared kind of like missions to have this right to self-organize without being burdened by either untrustworthy institutions or middlemen. And that includes relying on some upgrade committee or some validator set to tell you what transactions are valid or not. So you can think of blockchains as what I describe as top-level social contracts. So I'll describe what a social contract is in a second, but you can then think of like blockchains as having 3 layers. So you obviously have the data layer, and as layer 1, and layer 2 is computation, which is what the rollups do. And that's what the standard definition of layer 1s and 2s are. You have the data layer and then rollups. But there's a lot of like kind of like debate of what layer 0 is. But in this contract, I would actually say layer 0 is social consensus. Because as I said, ultimately, it's the social consensus of the rollup to define what the correct chain of that rollup is. Like, for example, Ethereum has hard forked many times with various network upgrades. And the reason why the ETH ticker, why the current Ethereum chain has the ETH ticker, is because the community of Ethereum has social consensus that those upgrades are valid, and that should be the chain that is associated with the ETH ticker or the chain known as Ethereum. But it could very well be the case that someone does a hard fork that people don't agree with, and then that chain wouldn't be canonically known as Ethereum. So, for example, Ethereum Classic, right? After the DAO hack, a bunch of people thought this was a bad fork, and then they kind of spun out into Ethereum Classic that did not follow the DAO hack fork. But even though Ethereum Classic was supposed to be the original chain, the broader community of Ethereum did not agree that that was the correct chain, and so that effectively means that the social consensus of a chain defines what that chain is. Ultimately, it's people that use this blockchain, and it's people that define that chain has value, or which specific fork of that chain has value. So in a similar way to like how with fiat currency, people decide that pieces of paper are worth value. Like on paper, they're not worth anything, but people agree that they have value, and so they do, and the market agrees with that. I think the reason why it's interesting is, if you look at the personal computing revolution in the 90s, the idea was like the individual could be sovereign. So then in the 2000s, you had like various like social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And the idea is like that gives individual sovereignty because they can express themselves without having to rely on like centralized media to spread messages. Instead, like people can kind of spread messages in a peer-to-peer way to each other directly, and that allows individuals to be sovereign. And you can think of blockchains as a kind of a community computing revolution. It allows communities to be sovereign because it allows communities to have their own state machines, or allows communities to effectively have shared computers with specific rules or programs in them that are collectively kind of enforced or have value because the social consensus of that community, there's a social contract among people in that community that they do have value. And that's why you have like set various DAOs. For example, DAOs is potentially a good interesting example of that. So I mentioned social contracts. So like, what are social contracts? So as a social contract is basically like agreement among a group of people that is kind of typically economic in nature. So like, I might agree to like, I'll buy your services and you provide this. So that's like a kind of like a contract between me and someone. But you can have like a more of a community kind of like contract where, for example, like one of the social contracts of Ethereum when it launched was that Ethereum started with proof of work, but it was always the case that it was kind of like very early on, there was the case that it was the expectation of the community that Ethereum would switch to proof of stake. So there was a social contract in Ethereum that we're going to switch to proof of stake. And that's why when Ethereum upgraded to proof of stake, it was very non-controversial, because it was like a social contract that participants in the Ethereum ecosystem already agreed on when Ethereum was effectively created. Where it was like with Bitcoin, for example, if you try to switch with proof of stake, that would be extremely controversial because that's not part of the social contract, or it's not part of the beliefs of the Bitcoin ecosystem. It was, but like, it never said in the Bitcoin white paper that we should switch to proof of stake later on. And you can kind of think about this as like, if you think about like traditional organizations. Sorry, 1 second. If you think about traditional organizations, like an organization or a company is basically a social contract among the kind of like the participants in the organization, like the shareholders, the employees, anyone who's got a contract with the organization. But like, what actually enforces the social contract or the contracts that organization has? Well, effectively, you have like a legal system that does, right? You have corporate law, and an organization is incorporated under a corporate law. For example, like, you might have company law in the UK or in the US, but like, who decides what that law is? You might have like a parliament in the UK, for example, or Congress in the US, or some kind of like governmental body that creates or democracy that creates or agrees on what these laws should be. But what gives a government or a certain constitution or a democracy legitimacy? Like, why do we agree that the 500 people in Congress have the ability to kind of create those create laws? It's because there's a social contract, effectively, that agrees that those laws have value. Yes, there's like the military and so on and so forth, but I felt ultimately the military consists of people that agree to be part of it. Like, we're all effectively participants in a kind of like a large scale social contract that agrees that these processes are the correct processes. These processes are actually processes that have value. But we've seen in history that these processes could be changed very quickly. Like, you have revolutions, for example, and revolutions can cause jurisdictions to have completely new constitutions and completely new processes and a completely new social contract. Now, what layer one's fundamentally enabled is this idea, like, for the first time in history, the fundamental thing that blockchains enable is this idea to have a social contract without going through like a government or some nation state. Because you can have a layer one blockchain like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and that the rules of that, you can embed rules in that chain, and the social contract and those rules basically implement the desires of a certain social contract. And I call these effectively top level social contracts, because there's no greater authority over that social contract. Like, who decides what the Bitcoin rules are? Well, who decides that the Bitcoin code base is the one that decides what the Bitcoin chain is, right? It's not some government or some jurisdiction. is this kind of like generic or like loose social contract among the users of Bitcoin all over the internet. That the Bitcoin chain is the correct chain that has value, effectively. And so that's the fundamental thing that blockchains enable. It allows you to effectively implement top-level social contracts for the first time, or basically create your own top-level like social contracts for the first time with no greater authority above it, without having to go to like some nation state, for example. Now, if you think about like application on layer one, if you deploy an application on layer one, like let's say it's a DAO, for example, that DAO is still is inheriting the social contract of the shared layer one. So for example, if you have a DAO on Ethereum, if you have DAO on Ethereum, that DAO is kind of inheriting the social contract of Ethereum, despite that DAO might have its own community and its own social consensus and its own social contract. Because Ethereum could hard fork and decide that the assets like introduce a new opcode or make a certain new opcode more expensive, or for example in DAO hack, undo certain transactions that happen in that DAO and so on and so forth. But with a sovereign chain, the kind of like the interesting thing about a sovereign chain, if you have a sovereign blockchain, whether it's layer one or a sovereign rollup, that chain, let's say you have a DAO on that chain, there isn't any other social contract above it. It's like its own social contract. It's like it's a top level social contract in its own right, and that kind of like is fundamentally like a new thing like that you can do for the first time in history. Like random people on the internet can get together and agree on certain values or certain on a certain goal, and then create a community computer for that goal, and embed certain values into it. And there's no one, assuming that computer is sufficiently decentralized and distributed, there is no one above that chain, and there was no one above that social contract. Like, and that's kind of like a very powerful thing that blockchains and layer ones and sovereign chains fundamentally enable. And that's why I think kind of sovereign rollups are very interesting, because they enable users or communities to create their own sovereign chains very easily or very quickly. Whereas historically, they would have to recruit a validator set. They have to create a proof of stake network from scratch using Cosmos or, for example, or Polkadot. So in terms of so sovereign rollups are still very early, but there's a few people kind of like working on frameworks to allow people to deploy sovereign rollups. So you have Sovereign SDK, for example, and Sovereign SDK is a framework for deploying sovereign ZK rollups written in Rust. Then you have Rollkit, and Rollkit is a framework for deploying sovereign Cosmos rollups. So you can literally build a Cosmos chain, and instead of having to use Tendermint or Comet BFT with its own proof of stake network, you can literally, like within seconds, deploy that Cosmos chain using some data layer to give you that shared security, but still retain the sovereignty of allowing your community to hard fork if something goes wrong, if there's a hack or bug, for example, without relying on some centralized committee of people or some upgrade process to decide if that hard fork should be considered valid or not. So it effectively gives like the same power that the Ethereum L1 had when DAO hack happened. Whereas like if you had a smart contract on Ethereum, that smart contract would not have that power. And finally, you can just simply create a sovereign rollup by posting and reading blobs directly to Celestia. You can, like, for example, create like a very simple state transition function that posts data to Celestia and then reads that data and then performs some computation over it. You can create, like, for example, a simple domain name application, or like a simple currency and so on and so forth. And this was actually like the original prototype in the lazy ledger paper was actually a prototype of application that reads data directly from Celestia, that kind of implemented a simple kind of currency system and a simple domain name system. So if you want to learn more about like the theory of sovereign rollups, you can check out this blog post. And if you want to kind of like dig into implementation, you can check out these frameworks. They're still very early on, I think Sovereign SDK is in DevNet, and then Rollgate is still kind of like more testnet phase. But as they mature, I expect to see more Sovereign rollups. Thank you, everyone. I'll open it to questions if there's any.
Awesome. Yeah, we have one in the chat. Thank you for teaching us about sovereign rollups, Mustafa. The first question is from Nicholas Martin. What would be a good app case for a sovereign rollup?
I would say like a DAO. A DAO with, for example, like a DAO with its own native asset would be kind of like a good use case of a sovereign rollup, because that DAO effectively has that DAO would not rely on upgrade committee. It would not rely on some committee or some token holder governance to decide on actions in that DAO. Also, the upgradability of the DAO. But like that DAO could have its own sovereignty directly. And there's kind of like more like sovereign rollups could be useful for any application, because like the actual definition of sovereign rollup is very controversial in the sense like optimism calls itself a sovereign rollup. Like there's argument that optimism is a sovereign rollup, because they say, well, actually no, it's not the bridge that defines the rollup. We could hard fork if we wanted to, like the community that defines a sovereign rollup. But of course, in practice, you need assets. You need to have assets actually natively deployed in that rollup for that to make sense. And the reason why sovereign rollups could make sense for any application is because, for example, as I mentioned, with the Sovereign SDK, those rollups can have way faster finality than a rollup with an enshrined settlement layer. We have to wait for ZK proofs to be posted and accepted by the bridge contract in a batch to have finality. In a sovereign rollup, you can like have users or some set of decentralized sequences post data directly to the chain, and as soon as that data is posted, that the state transitions in that rollup are finalized.
And how would you mint assets on a sovereign rollup, or how would you have assets on a sovereign rollup if they don't rely on some other like chain or contract?
Or for example, like if in the example of a DAO, that you could have its own DAO token, for example, inside that rollup. But instead of bridging that DAO token from another chain, just mint it directly inside your chain. You would have a contract inside your chain that does the minting, instead of minting it somewhere else and then bringing it over.
So is there a case where there's a hard fork on Celestia that would impact like sovereign rollups the same way that the DAO hack impacted Ethereum broadly?
That's a good question. It's possible that a fork of Celestia could a fork of Celestia would not be able to violate the transaction validity rules of a rollup. Like it wouldn't be able to say like, hey, I'm going to change this state transition function of this rollup to make certain transactions valid or other transactions invalid, or like say like, or Celestia can't fork to say like, hey, I'm going to print a bunch of money on that rollup. Whereas like a rollup with an enshrined element can do that, because if the bridge is not L1, then like you can hard fork the rollup to change what the bridge believes to be the correct chain.
I guess maybe the only thing that could happen there is like you don't like something that Celestia implemented, you could switch DA layers. Your rollup could still be sovereign. You would just change your DA layer.
Yeah, I mean it's possible that like although Celestia can't violate the transaction validity rules of the rollup, it could like do a reorg or undo certain transactions. But that's kind of like that's already the security model of Bitcoin and Ethereum. Like the security model of Bitcoin and Ethereum is that you're only trusting the validator set for censorship resistance and preventing double spends, but you're not trusting the validator set for transaction correctness or transaction validity. And that's the same with a sovereign rollup that uses Celestia.
And what are the potential attack vectors or like points of fault with sovereign rollups that you know of?
Well, I think ultimately it just boils down to what the bridging ecosystem for rollups looks like. As I mentioned, like even if you're a sovereign rollup, but 99% of your assets are coming from one bridge, then is it really a sovereign rollup? So like one potential failure case is like if one bridge becomes overly powerful for that rollup, similar to what Ethereum also has a similar flaw where you can argue that Circle and Tether, because they control have influence over which chain is correct, that actually honors USDC and USDT. You'd argue that like Ethereum is actually a bridge to Circle and Tether, and those entities actually define what what Ethereum chain is, and Ethereum has lost a little bit of sovereignty that way.
And so today, most rollups are settled rollups. They're like smart contract rollups. And there might be a few sovereign rollups out there, but there's not very many. Why do you think sovereign rollups will succeed in the long term?
So I think the reason why they will succeed is because if you look at the current market for rollups, a lot like a majority of like there's basically like hundreds of rollups in the pipelines like being deployed. Like L2Beat was like, like 5 rollups 2 years ago. Now it's like something like 50 rollups. And there's like hundreds more in the pipelines. Thanks to rollup as a service providers, making it very easy to deploy these rollups. But I think if you look at like why people are deploying these rollups, they're deploying application specific rollups. Like instead of deploying a new smart contract, they're deploying a new rollup with the application. But they're not deploying a rollup necessarily to scale in an L1, right? It's not like 2 years ago we had like Optimism and Arbitrum 1, and those mainnet rollups exist to scale the Ethereum L1. We're seeing recently more and more application devs simply building application specific rollups, not because they want to scale L1, but because it just makes sense for the application, right? Like the purpose of application specific rollup is not to scale L1, it's just to have a good application, right? So I think sovereign rollups could have a superior developer user experience by having less constraints as L3s or rollups that require to enshrine a specific bridge. And like in the future, if your goal is just to deploy application specific chain, you just want to deploy the application, you don't necessarily care about scaling Ethereum, then you might be very interested in deploying a sovereign rollup, especially if the user experience for that rollup is better. So, for example, with as I mentioned, with Sovereign SDK, you have faster finality, and you can write your contracts, you can write your application in Rust, for example. With Rocket, you can create a Cosmos chain, for example, and so on and so forth.
And we have some questions from the audience now. First one is from Santosh A. How do we make rollups more decentralized?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's different kind of there's different meanings when we say decentralized. Like for example, the one that applies to all rollups with the sovereign or settle would be censorship resistance. So for example, like a lot of rollups have single sequencers, but that's okay as long as there's a way for users to force transactions to be included on the rollup if the sequencer is censoring transactions. So for example, with Arbitrum, even though they have a single sequencer, you can still if that sequencer is censoring transactions. Sorry.
Oh, good.
The end user who's being censored can still submit their transactions to what's called a inbox that would force the sequencer to include that transaction anyway. And in that way, the rollup is basically inheriting the decentralization of the base layer. And in any well-constructed rollup, that's always going to be the case. But what this presentation is more about is digging into how decentralized is the upgrade process for rollup, right? As I mentioned, with a rollup with a single bridge, there's like that the bridge, all the bridges typically have some kind of except for Fuel V1, all the bridges have some kind of upgrade process, and that typically involves either like some token holder governance by DAO or some upgrade committee, And to me, that's very centralized. As I mentioned, that defeats the whole point of a blockchain, even if it's token holder governance. Like I don't think it should be like whoever has the most money gets to decide what the rules of the chain are, right?
Right.
So as I mentioned, we can make more rollups more decentralized by using sovereign rollups that don't rely on a single bridge. Either have like a wide variety of bridges, like how Optimism plans to have like multiple bridges, not multiple canonical bridges. Like you can have optimistic bridge and a ZK bridge, for example, and kind of like have a lot of the assets in the rollup minted directly. This makes sense this makes more sense in some cases more than others. But if your rollup has a lot of native assets, then mint those assets directly in your rollup, not somewhere else, and then bridge them over.
So I guess in summary, sovereign rollups are the answer to that. What about I guess most sequencing is centralized. Does decentralized sequencing kind of open the doors for that to grow?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people working on decentralized sequences, including Astria, which is building like decentralized sequencer on Celestia. And I think decentralized sequences are very, depending on how they're constructed, because it can be a good idea for increasing censorship resistance. Even if you have an on-chain inbox that we can bypass the sequencer, it's typically the case that on-chain inbox, like for example, might have a 24-hour period where your transaction is only included after 24 hours. So although it does provide censorship resistance, but even if you have one sequencer, it's like very slow censorship resistance. So if you have decentralized sequencers, that will increase the speed of the censorship resistance, because like you can have immediate censorship resistance or closer to immediate kind of censorship resistance, because you no longer have to rely you don't have to use the forced inbox if one validator is being dishonest, because you can rely on the other sequencers.
We have a get well soon, Mustafa pillow turquoise hot chocolate from Sammy. Thank you, Sammy. And
Thank you.
Bear is wishing a speedy recovery as well. Another question from the chat is from Yaz, and he's asking, is it true that if there's a disagreement in a sovereign rollup community, it can fork while keeping same level of security due to shared security?
Yeah, definitely. Because like it doesn't matter what, like even like if let's say you have a sovereign rollup on Celestia and it forks, like both sides of the fork are still posting the data to Celestia, right? And so like if the sequences on both sides or either side of the fork misbehave, that data will still be on Celestia, whichever side of the fork you're using, and that data can be used to create fraud proofs or ZK proofs or so on and so forth. So it is the case that if there's a kind of like a contentious hard fork within rollup, both sides of the fork will still inherit shared security from Celestia or the DA layer.
The next question is from Nicholas. Is a sovereign rollup a roll app or an app chain?
I don't know what's the difference. An app chain,
Yeah.
a roll up is just a roll up. Is just an app chain that's a roll up, right? So I guess
Yeah.
technically it's a roll up.
I actually have a
Or
similar
maybe is that or is that roll? Do you mean roll app or roll up?
roll app,
Do you mean,
yeah, or an app chain, or they're all the
well,
same.
either way, it's ambiguous because it could be a typo. Because it's a typo either way. Because it can
True.
either be the definition of a roll up or roll up with a U. But
Let's
either
go with
way, like
roll
it's
app.
not.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, technically it is a roll up because it's an app chain that's a roll up.
Yep. And would you consider a roll up a blockchain?
Absolutely, like a roll up is a blockchain. It's a chain. It's a chain of blocks that post its blocks to another blockchain.
For
So it's
sure.
basically a blockchain inside of a blockchain, similar to how like a virtual machine is a computer inside a computer, and people use virtual machines today on AWS and just DigitalOcean as a default way to develop and deploy their applications.
So getting to kind of like the modular ecosystem side of this, I think in the last like year and a half or so, the ecosystem has come a long way. You mentioned a few frameworks that people can build sovereign rollups with. We've also seen a lot of settled rollups that post data to Celestia. What would you like to see in the next like 12 to 18 months in the ecosystem? Like, what are the big goals?
Yeah, as I mentioned right now, like Sovereign SDK is in DevNet, and Rocket, you can deploy rollups there, but it's kind of like closer to the testnet phase. So I think I kind of want to see more like Sovereign Rollups framework mature more, so that they're more production ready, and more like developer UX friendlier from a developer UX perspective. And finally, I want to see like once those frameworks are more production ready, even though you can experiment with them already, I want to see rollup as a service providers support the Sovereign Rollup frameworks, so you can actually deploy Sovereign Rollups using a rollup as a service provider. Because as I mentioned, my thesis is that a majority of developers deploying applications on rollups as service providers using rollups, they're not doing it to scale L1. They're doing it because creating a rollup application specific chain is simply a good way to deploy a decentralized application, whether or not it scales a specific L1.
And in the more near term, we have a question from Yazikin. What are some things you'd like to see the hackers build in the hackathon?
Yeah, as I mentioned, one of the things it could be like a DAO, like a DAO created as a sovereign rollup, either using Sovereign SDK or Rollkit, where most of the assets in that DAO are natively minted, and that's kind of like really powerful because it's a DAO that has its own social consensus. So now you can like spin up DAOs that have the ability to hard fork, which is really powerful. And another thing that would be cool to see on more of like a infrastructure experiment is like experiments with like just not like don't instead of using a framework, create some kind of application that reads and writes data to Celestia directly. That could be like any application. So like what if you took, for example, like I don't know, like what if you took like I don't know, like a Pokemon game or something,
Mhm.
and you made it like a community computer by making it possible so that anyone can submit transaction on chain to do certain keyboard presses in that game, and like someone could replay the entire game um, by kind of like looking on chain and reading the Celestia data and replaying the keyboard controls, and like people, and if that kind of like roll up as assets, you can make it so like okay, if you own that asset, you have the ability to make a movement in that game, for example. But why this is interesting is because kind of like a cool experiment is because it allows you to create um, like roll-ups with any arbitrary computer program, like or any arbitrary execution environment. Like you could literally use like a NES simulator with Pokemon on it. Whereas like previously without sovereign roll-ups, you'd have to make sure like you can compile your roll-up into some fraud-proof system that the EVM understands, or you would have to like ZK prove your roll-up, which kind of like is very limiting, right?
Yeah.
Whereas with this, you can like literally take any computer program and do that. Like you can take like some desktop and do that, for example, like a literal Linux desktop, for example.
And a follow-up question to that from Garang Patel is, wouldn't it be quite expensive to record all the steps a player takes?
I don't think so because like I expect in most games or computer programs, it's just like keyboard presses, right?
Yeah.
So it's like press up or like press certain keys a certain number of times, for example. It's like one character. It's like one. It's like it takes like 1 byte to record that information.
Right. Like a byte per
Yeah,
transaction, basically.
exactly.
And I more on the fun side of things here. People might have seen the sloths, the Celestian sloths recently. I'm wondering what the next laziest animal or thing you could see being built as an NFT collection on Celestial.
That's a good question. Like,
Oh
So
no,
my baby is a snail.
the snail. Nice.
A snail is lazy animal. Maybe it's something more creative, but like just googling
That's great.
some stuff. Yeah.
And that's all I have for questions today. I'll do a last call in case there's any last ones in the chat. Thank you again for teaching us all today, and we look forward to seeing what Sovereign Rollups people build during the hackathon, maybe Snail Chain. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending and wishing everyone a good time during the hackathon. Mustafa, do you have any last words?
Nothing except for build modular and be sovereign.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.